Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. You can subscribe to our show on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio, or you can add our RSS feed to your podcatcher. Please follow us on Twitter or Google+, with links in the show notes. And please give us feedback. You can leave us a review on iTunes, send us a tweet, send us an email, or leave us a message on Google+. And I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. For details on how to support the show, you can visit our site at pythonpodcast.com. We are recording today on August 12th, 2015, and your hosts as usual are Tobias, Macey, and Patti. Today we're interviewing Jessica McKellar. Jessica, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica. I live in San Francisco. I run an engineering group at Dropbox, and I'm, at this point, a pretty long time contributor to the Python community. In particular, I was a director for the Python Software Foundation for several years. Back in Boston, I was an organizer for the Boston Python user group while it grew to become the largest Python user group in the world, in large part due to a bunch of very concerted diversity outreach initiatives that we were running that I'm quite proud of. I've also been the diversity chair for PyCon for the past several years. And I spend basically all of my travel is around attending Python conferences, much to the consternation of my husband.
So how did you get introduced to Python?
Yeah, so I went to MIT, although initially to pursue chemistry. I was one of those science Olympiad nerds in high school. I was actually president of the science Olympiad team. And I, through those experiences, through my chemistry classes in high school, I really thought that I was going to be a chemist, and that's what I declared. And I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry. While I was pursuing that degree, I had a bunch of friends who were pursuing computer science degrees. And so sort of looking at them out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that they were learning what seemed like this really compelling toolkit full of tools for solving sort of arbitrary important problems in the world. And that felt pretty different, honestly, from what I was covering in my chemistry classes. I love those, but it seemed like a pretty different set of skills and a set of skills that might be worth investigating. So I ended up taking a couple of computer science classes to test the water, got sort of immediately hooked, and ended up getting a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in computer science. Which is sort of a long way of getting to the point that I was at MIT right as we were transitioning from Lisp to Python for a bunch of our core classes. And so my exposure was through school, through university, like right as part of this transition. So about half of my classes were in Lisp and half were in Python. And that was my very first exposure. But then I ended up using Python for basically all of my internships, and I've used Python with every job that I've had outside of school. So I've been a founder for, or a participant or a founder in a couple of startups that have been acquired. That's part of how I got to Dropbox, and all of those startups have used Python. And Dropbox is actually perhaps the largest distributor of a Python application in the world at this point. Dropbox has about 400 million users, and our desktop client is written in Python. So that was kind of a long answer to your question, including a lot of extraneous details, but I learned Python in school, and then I've used it ever since.
No, it's all valuable information, and we appreciate the background. It's always nice getting a lot of rich detail about people's experience with Python and how you came in contact with it initially. So, no, definitely appreciate that.
And how it evolved into taking part in something like Dropbox, which, as you said, sort of like behind the scenes leverages Python to make people's lives better every day. So that's very cool. Thanks.
Cool.
So can you describe what your responsibilities as a director of the PSF were?
Yeah, so the PSF does not attempt to steward the language. The Python core developers and the associated community are really driving the direction for that. Actually, I could mention that Guido does work at Dropbox, so I see him every day, although he's on vacation right now. So the PSF is much more focused on stewarding the community around the language. And this is everything from underwriting PyCon to so we're a 501c3 nonprofit, so we're able to collect and disperse funds as a nonprofit to various initiatives. We support a bunch of user groups. We finance a bunch of Python, not just conferences, but like local user group events, workshops, things like that. We have a dedicated outreach and education committee that I co-chair that is specifically focused on sort of Python in education and bringing Python to new populations. So a lot of this is around outreach and the community sort of spending money to invest in the community.
So do you think the PSF does a good job of making people aware of what it is, what it does for the community, and how they can help?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's a great question because it's definitely something that we have historically struggled with. I think we're doing a lot better these days, in part because we have some folks who are dedicated to the comms side of things. So we have someone who is like dedicated to writing blog posts, managing some of the social media and things like that. There's certainly, I think, more that we could do. If you pretended that the PSF, like that the Python community were a startup and like you had a marketing budget and how would you spend it, you would probably spend it a little bit differently from how we do as this fairly loose collective of open source enthusiasts. But we've definitely gotten a lot better about this over the last year, I would say. A thing that was, it was maybe a little bit painful to fully realize the fruits of the labor, but the website redesign was actually a really big deal because I don't know if people remember the old Python website at this point, but it looked like it was from the early 90s and didn't look like the language of the future. And like the way that you present yourself, your first impression as a language really does make a big difference for new users and potential users.
Yeah, I can definitely remember when the update to the site was happening and seeing some of the previews and looking at that versus the old site. It's definitely very much improved, and it was definitely a good step in the right direction. And actually, if you're looking at different spots in the wiki, you can still see the old site design.
Yeah.
So a large focus of your work in the community has been around improving the experience of users who are new to Python and programming in general. And I noticed that you just received the Frank Willison Memorial Award for your contributions to outreach and education in the Python community. What is your motivation behind this particular focus?
Well, it's probably at least twofold. So one is that I have a great deal of empathy for the new user and the beginner because I started programming, I wouldn't say late in life, but compared to a lot of my friends, I felt like a real latecomer. I was not one of those wonderkind who was programming when I was 4 or 5 years old. So I have a lot of empathy for the new user and the beginner, and I just have this natural sort of love and desire to support that population. The other big reason is that, I think that knowing how to program changes the way that you think about the world. It's this incredibly empowering experience where when you realize that a bunch of these things that exist, you have the ability to change. Things that seem impossible because of the scale or the scope or whatever, you have the ability to automate. And that's an incredibly powerful experience to have. And I want as many people as possible to have that experience. And if you want a lot of people to have that experience, that necessitates sort of focusing on the top of the funnel, which is people who are new to programming and who are new to Python. So a big part of this for me is just, a lot of what I do is also focused on diversity outreach, and a lot of this is about empowering people in a way that I think is actually incredibly meaningful in this world. And like programming is just an incredibly powerful tool, and I want lots of people to have that experience.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to your experience and your thoughts of coming to programming later in life, because like you, I didn't start programming until I was into my early to mid 20s. And so I definitely have times where I think, oh, well, if only I had been programming 10 years earlier or whatever and gotten introduced to it a little earlier. But it's just one of those things where you start where you start and you make the best of it. And I think that with enough motivation, anybody, regardless of when they start in life, can make a really big impact and gain a lot of valuable experience in programming.
Definitely.
Has the situation for newcomers running Windows who wish to try Python gotten any better since your keynote at Kiwi PyCon?
Yeah, so some things have. In particular, right around that time, I think we were rolling out the release that changed some of the setup work that you have to do. I don't know if people in the audience, like if you think back to if you've ever had to set up Python on Windows, you do a bunch of goofy stuff, like you have to set like various path environment variables and other things that are incredibly arcane to new programmers. And some of that now happens under the hood for you in newer versions of Python. So that is like a very concrete win. And I'm super glad that that's gone out. I would say that the state of the world is still not as great as it could be on a bunch of dimensions. I mean, not even just so like the experience of having to install Python, possibly needing to install a compiler, depending on what libraries you need to use. That there's still a lot of pain there that could be abstracted away. Also, the sort of the onboarding experience for new users, Windows or otherwise, is actually the state of the art there has evolved quite a bit, and I think that there's an opportunity for the Python community to look towards some of our sort of peer languages and learn a lot from those from the innovations that they've had. Like a really concrete example of this is like if you go to the Ruby website, they have a really slick in-browser learn Ruby in 10 minutes experience that does a really good job of hooking you without requiring any installation. It's all in browser. And I think we have a real opportunity to invest in some of those really early experiences for new users. This is not specific to Windows, but it would certainly impact anybody who wants to start learning Python.
Absolutely, because having to do any kind of installation process at all for really new users can be intimidating, and being able to just say, look, you have a web browser. This is something that you use every day. You don't need anything else. Just go here and get a sense for it. That could be a big win. So leading into our next question, do batteries included distributions like Anaconda help, or is it the same problem of visibility you discussed in your talk?
Yeah, so and some of this again goes to like the very, very earliest taste of Python, and like where's the right place for you to experience that? Is that on your computer after you've installed some software, or is it in the web? And that's like a really interesting conversation to have. And then the thing about Anaconda and these other installations is that, like, how would a new user know that that's what they're supposed to do to have the easiest experience? There's like an information flow / what are your default options question here that I think we could become more opinionated about in our onboarding material. This is all getting pretty tactical, but like I think that it would probably be really healthy for us to do a pass at the way that we onboard new users and pick off like the 5 pieces of lowest hanging fruit, and that would have a ton of impact. And one of these things might be having a very pointed recommendation about what version of Python or what sort of Python IDE you install or whatever. Just having some strong opinions there so that new users don't have to go like research the debate for themselves.
Yeah, that ties into the whole convention versus configuration debate that has been going on for a long time around languages, frameworks, various other tooling, and how the frameworks such as Rails or Ember that just have a lot of this is how you do it, you don't have to think about it, can really take a lot of the load off of the person using the framework because they don't have that cognitive load of, okay, you have all of these decisions to make before you can even start to write your first line. So having that in terms of the sort of newcomer startup kit, I think would definitely be very valuable because it would remove all of those initial choices, and so that you can just focus on getting introduced to the language, starting to tinker with it, and then as you go through that, you can start to say, oh, well, this particular tool in the kit doesn't work exactly how I want it to, and then you can start investigating what your alternatives are. So that definitely makes a lot of sense.
I also feel like you mentioned taking examples from our peer languages. I think something like Go has benefited tremendously from this, in the sense that the people who designed the language made an awful lot of this is the way to do it, like decisions around it, right? Like this is the officially sanctioned Go coding style, and these are the officially sanctioned Go tools. And, you know, it makes the sort of, as you said, the onboarding process, even though their tools are not necessarily as polished as even Python's are in some respects, the fact that there is only one way to do it, and it's very clearly documented and very easy to wrap your head around, makes it easier for people.
Yeah, I would argue, though, that Python does have a better story around some of that than, you know, maybe some alternative languages, because of the heavy emphasis on the Zen of Python and the one obvious way of doing things. You know, there's definitely dozens of options of ways to do things, but at least particularly with the standard library having so many different batteries included, it can reduce the need to reach out to third-party libraries just to get going. So it removes some of that inertia and confusion if you just tell people, okay, just focus on what's in the standard library for this particular set of tasks, and then you can start exploring what the greater ecosystem has to offer. So you've presented a number of times about the future of Python and how we can all help to make sure that story is a happy one. How has the material for that talk changed over the past few years?
Yeah, the thing that I'm thinking about the most these days is about the fact that we, as a largely volunteer-driven community, are necessarily resource constrained, and how to sort of maximize the impact of the bandwidth that we have, and like how to make convincing arguments about the things that are highest impact, and then getting people to go do them. And so this is increasingly focusing on some of exactly the things that we've been talking about the top of the funnel. What makes languages successful? Well, there are a couple of things that go into making a language successful for the long haul, but a very important part of it is like continuing to win over new users in a variety of contexts, have them fall in love with the language, and then contribute back to the ecosystem. So that top of the funnel is really important. And this implies, and we could and should be metrics driven around this. Again, like if we were a startup, we would be measuring this stuff better and like reflecting on the metrics and then using the metrics to inform the way that we prioritize what we work on. But what is probably true based on just observations about the community is that we should be investing more time in those very early experiences, the way that people like hit python.org, install our software, and like their first 5 minutes in, their first 5 minutes of the REPL, or possibly their first 5 minutes in the browser, whichever, ends up being the more compelling experience. And then another big part of this is, whoever wins in education has a huge leg up for the longevity of the language. I would like Python to be a language that people still want to use 10 years from now, 15 years from now. It has a bunch of like really, really great properties across a variety of areas. And a really good way to ensure that is for it to be taught in high schools and in universities. And so there's this whole separate question of how you ensure that happens, if that's a good choice as a learning language. And Python actually has the steepest positive trajectory of any language in universities. There are some folks who track this. So the data on this is looking very good, but I think we could make an even more concerted effort in this space. Actually, very, very exciting. I mean, I've talked about this before, but there's actually a new, so I live in the United States, and I took the advanced placement in computer science class when it was taught in C++ in high school. And a lot of people have like somewhat tortured memories of their high school computing classes, often derived from the AP curricula, which tend to be like quite dry. And there's a new advanced placement computing class that has been developed and is just about to come out of pilot. It's a computing principles class, and it's much more focused on the way that you can use programming to have an impact in the world. It's much more interdisciplinary, and it frankly has like a much more engaging curriculum. But one of the really interesting things about this AP class is that it does not specify the language of implementation. So there's a real opportunity for Python. Like if this AP class takes off, and honestly, I think it will because of how compelling the general curriculum is, there's a real opportunity for Python to get into the hands of a lot more people before university through this program. Like if we're very smart about being available to teachers and collaborating with teachers to develop the Python curricula around the general framework for this AP class. Like that would be a very exciting, concrete thing for the Python community to invest in.
Yeah, having the earlier introduction, as you mentioned in your talk, it really gives people a good grounding in the language, and also when they do go out and start building things, they're more likely to use Python as that language.
Oh yeah, it's not an accident that the startups that I've been a part of have all used Python. It's like we were a bunch of MIT nerds who came out of MIT having learned Python.
Yeah, definitely. And although on the conversely, personally anyway, when I was in school, I was learning with C++ and Java, and quickly fled that as soon as I started picking up Python. So The early introduction is important, but it also needs to be a language that is easy to think and reason about. And not to say that Java isn't necessarily, but as anybody who has ever used both Java and Python can attest, Java is definitely much more formal in terms of its programming style versus Python, whereas Python is a little bit more literate, I suppose, would be the way to put it. But,
sure, and some of this is, some of this maybe is attributable to the language. Some of this is maybe attributable to the curricula that are easy to build around a language at the high school or middle school level. Mm-hmm. But it's a real problem for our community that AP Computer Science is the most gender skewed AP class that exists right now. And like, if we have an opportunity to help change that ratio, that's a pretty big opportunity for us, because we suffer the downstream effects of this skew even at the high school level.
So what do you anticipate will be the talking points for this topic over the next few years?
Sorry, for this topic, can you scope that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So going back to the previous question about how the future of Python, or I guess what the highest priority aspects of the Python community are, what we can be channeling our efforts into. What do you think will be the most high priority items over the next couple of years?
I mean, what I honestly think should be the highest priority is, again, this top of the funnel question. Mm-hmm. So exactly as we discussed. I think there are some other really interesting conversations around how we're we're a language operating in a market that is evolving very quickly. Python doesn't have to win everywhere. Python doesn't necessarily have to be the language that you use not only for your server-side development, but also for your desktop development, and also for your mobile development, and also for your, brain-to-computer interface of the future. Like, we don't have to win everywhere, but we should be very smart about continuing to be a very generally relevant language across a bunch of different domains. And what that may require is, if we're capable of it, is this fairly distributed open source community, is like putting in the work to ensure that we're still being successful in at least a couple of these key areas. Like, we may need to sort of really champion a couple of key areas where I think it's important for Python to still be a leader and still be really successful. And like, maybe that happens organically through, again, being really smart about getting a bunch of new excited users across a variety of domains, or maybe it's through individuals who are real champions for that part of the ecosystem. Maybe it's being smart about where we invest the dollars of the PSF. Maybe it's being really intelligent about partnerships, but it's a combination for me of like the education and top of the funnel thing. And then, if one of the big value props of Python is that it's this really generally useful language, it needs to continue to be very generally useful, even as the market shifts.
So if you could grade the Python community on how well they've listened to and acted on the calls to action in your talks over the past few years, what would you give them?
I don't want to grade the Python community. I mean, everyone is welcome to contribute to this in whichever way is motivating for them. And some people are really motivated to work on like nitty gritty bugs in our threading libraries. And some people are really motivated to teach Python at schools. And some people are motivated to do other things. And they're all totally valid. It's a hard problem to rally a bunch of largely volunteers to affect some of this change. I think a thing that is really interesting for us to consider, and I know people have strong opinions on both sides, but I think it would be very interesting for us to consider is, if we believe that we need sort of consistent investment in some key areas, how do we ensure that happens? And maybe the way that happens is that we're paying people, or we're partnering with companies that have developers who are paid to make these contributions on behalf of the community. That's certainly the way that it works with other, some other large open source projects. The Linux kernel is, of course, a classic example of this these days. And that would be a pretty interesting conversation to have, at least.
Absolutely. There's absolutely no doubt that when you have the sheer resources of a company behind you, that it greases the skids, right? Like, if you have people who can say, X% of my time is officially sanctioned for contributing to the Python, blah, blah project, then, you just know a lot more commits are going to happen. It's going to get a lot more consistent support. The user community is going to be a lot better taken care of. It really makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
So in your Kiwi PyCon talk, you mentioned Kivy as an example of a great way to do mobile software development in Python. It feels to me like the Kivy team is still not getting the community involvement and buy-in they should. How can we help make Kivy the mobile app development platform of choice for beginners?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's this is a tough spot for the language to be in when you have a default platform which is not us for development for mobile, be it Java for Android or Objective-C or Swift for iOS. It's going to be a tough battle no matter what. How do you get anything adopted? Well, hopefully it's providing a bunch of value that when people have exposure to it, they see the value and it makes them want to develop using these libraries and then contribute back to the ecosystem. So maybe some of this is a marketing thing and just a brand awareness thing. And maybe there are some smart ways to help with this around the PSF partnering with Kivy on ways to increase awareness, running contests and things like that. Maybe some of this is being really smart about getting mobile development in Python into places like schools where they already have a bunch of curricula around doing like fun mobile or game developments in possibly other languages. But to be totally honest, it's a pretty tough problem, and like users vote with their feet on what is actually providing the most value to them. Yeah, I don't have a great answer here, but it is one of those. There's sort of there's the opportunity for a virtuous cycle here, right? Like if you reach a critical mass of people who are using a library and then who are contributing back to it, like the functionality increases, it becomes more relevant to more people, and that causes more and more people to discover and then use and then give back to the community in this virtuous cycle. And it would be great for us to hit that point with Kivy. I don't think we've sort of reached that critical mass yet.
One thing that's always impressed me about Kivy that, you talk about like users voting with their feet around what gives them the most value, that none of the other mobile platforms that you mentioned, like Java for Android or Swift or Objective-C for iOS, give you. Actually, maybe Swift does, I'm not sure. But when you develop an app in Kivy, it's not even just a mobile app, right? It's a mobile desktop, like wherever you can possibly care to run it app. And I would think that could be a really big win for people who want to develop applications that run on any platform, on the desktop, on the tablet, on their phone, whatever.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, maybe it's an awareness issue. Maybe people need some great examples in front of them that inspire them to want to do this themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, I think one of the things that could help with adoption as well for Kivy in particular is to have a bit more native feeling widgets in their toolkit, because I know that particularly in desktop, when people are designing desktop applications, a lot of times they're trying to make it feel integrated into the overall operating system, whereas, for instance, the Java Swing interface does not. So that's why a lot of people tend to like to use, for instance, PyQt for doing desktop clients, because the Qt widgets generally have a bit more of a native feel, whereas with Kivy, all of their widgets are completely custom to the Kivy library. But I do know that they've also been doing a lot of work recently to introduce more pre-styled widgets so that there's a little bit less inertia for getting the particular styling done, because, well, you do have the complete freedom to add whatever styling and assets and what have you to a Kivy app. It does require a bit of an extra upfront investment to actually generate those assets.
So game development as an entree to programming has been a recurring theme in our podcast. Has the Python game dev scene improved at all since 2013? And do you still see the same pitfalls holding people back, like app packaging, or have we moved on to different problems?
I would say the problems are largely the same. unfortunately. And some of these problems are hard but tractable, but there are still a lot of issues around packaging, around the complexity of installing some of these libraries on some platforms. Yeah.
It's interesting because, I mean, you know, I don't mean to sort of harp or use it as a hobby horse, but I do also think that one of the things that's making Go successful, and maybe even Rust too, I'm not sure, but definitely Go, not so much for games, but just in general, is the fact that when you build a Go binary, it's very easy to package it up so it's this completely standalone thing that requires no, you know, supporting libraries or anything else. You can just plunk the binary down where you want to go and you're done. That's it. And I know solutions for this exist in Python. I kind of wonder if maybe that's like another sort of organizational thing of maybe we need to sort of like include some of these mechanisms in the standard distribution and give people better instructions on how to use them so that people know that you can do that kind of thing with Python and just produce a freestanding, you know, binary blob that they can just install, right?
Yeah, I definitely think the status quo here is a tough spot for some use cases, gaming being a really good example. I mean, just if you, I talked about this in the Kiwi PyCon talk, but like when you read the reviews on these, so there are a bunch of like weekend or week long like game hackathons that happen online. And when you read the feedback about the games written in Python, it's sort of heartbreaking. People are like, I refuse to do this. Like, I refuse to install Python to play your game. Or, oh, I've been there before. I definitely know that I'm not going to be able to get Pygame installed, so I'm just not even going to try. So the status quo does feel pretty broken, and I think like some creative experiments about how to get around this would definitely be worth our while in the community.
Yeah, and I think that this is actually another spot where Kivy and the Kivent game engine can come in to help save some of that story for Python, because there have definitely been a number of games written using Kivy and with the Kivent game engine as well to help provide better support for, you know, 2D games. And a big part of the Kivy toolchain as well is the ability to more easily generate those binaries for the various platforms using their Bulldozer tool. So maybe with some better awareness around that whole ecosystem, we can improve the story for Python and get more people interested in creating games with Python. So what do you view as the biggest threats to the popularity of Python currently, and what can we do to address them?
I mean, one of them is that there are languages that are seeing increasing adoption in areas that have historically been our sort of real core competencies and areas of strength. This is stuff around typically server-side development. And like, why are they becoming more popular? I think some of this is around perception issues around performance, perception issues around maintainability, and that's something that we should think deeply about and address proactively. And then I think actually being insufficiently proactive about continuing to fuel the top of the funnel and to be this language that new people are learning all the time is like the way that languages end up dying accidentally. Why don't people learn Perl anymore? And how can we avoid falling into that trap?
Definitely. And I know that there are some, you know, one of the biggest talking points that I see when people are talking about moving away from Python for various other languages is, as you mentioned, that performance story, and particularly being able to support multi-core without having to necessarily use the multiprocessing module and fork off a bunch of different processes, which can become fairly heavyweight. And I know that there's been some work done in a number of projects, including the PyPy STM and the Piston project being done at Dropbox, and also PyParallel, which is being sponsored by Continuum Analytics. So it'll be interesting to see how all of those projects progress and if any of them gain more widespread adoption, or if any of those lessons learned from those projects end up making it back into the core Python distribution, the CPython distribution. It'll be interesting to see that happen.
Yeah, I do think for what it's worth that a large part of this is a perception issue, and that a lot of folks are choosing other languages based on performance concerns, when in reality Python is, like, with the appropriate architecture, Python is definitely totally sufficient. And what's interesting about that is, like, how do you fix perception issues? Like, some of this comes back to, like, a little bit of a marketing problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because a lot of lip service is paid to the GIL and how that hampers our ability to do multi-core, where, as you said, using appropriate concurrency routines or even libraries such as Twisted or Tornado or Gevent to provide better async support for IO-bound applications, or even using something like Numba for numerical compute-bound applications can get you where you need to be without necessarily having to switch languages. And then there's also the Cython project.
I actually think, you talked about it being potentially a marketing problem. I think part and parcel of that, and the kind of the way to solve that, right, is to get some of these projects that are solving these problems, like Piston, like PyPy, like PyParallels, to get them sort of more out there, get them talking, get them more visibility. We'd love to talk to the Piston or PyParallels folks, and I think sort of all of the other industry or community efforts around awareness and marketing should do the same. We basically need to stop bemoaning the GIL and start emphasizing the positive side of what we're actually doing about it and how we're working around these kind of problems every day. I mean, I know for a fact that there are a ton of people out there in the real world using Twisted and more async IO as an example. In fact, we had one of them, the author of PT Python. He's using async IO in his project, and the folks from the IPython notebook thought it was a really great way to implement things, and they may be implementing his solution as part of the IPython core. So I think we need to do more of that, sort of like really focus on what we're doing and how we're walking the walk, as opposed to the limitations.
Oh, and you're mentioning IPython notebook got me excited to ensure to bring up one other point, which is, like, one of the great sort of accidental success stories of the Python community is how quickly we've been adopted in various scientific communities. When a scientist sits down with an IPython notebook for the first time, like, their minds are blown and their lives are changed forever. It's a truly incredible experience to watch. And one of the nonprofits that I work with is called Software Carpentry, which is sort of dedicated to teaching software engineering fundamentals and best practices to scientists, and which is great for scientists because it makes them more efficient. It helps with reproducible research, things like that. But Python has become a real darling of many parts of the scientific community, and that was a little bit of an accident, and that's something that I think we should really embrace and invest in.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of focus on that particular industry in Python, and we've actually had a number of people on the show to talk about the various aspects of Python in the sciences and Python in data science and analytical applications. So it's definitely nice to hear those stories and seeing where Python is gaining that popularity. I know that, I think it was Travis Oliphant who we spoke with, mentioned that there's also a similar organization to Software Carpentry called Data Carpentry that's focusing on teaching those same skills to statisticians and analysts to improve their work.
Cool.
But yeah, definitely some more topics that would be interesting to have in future shows. So I understand that you were involved in the formation of the OpenHatch organization, and as you mentioned before, you serve on their board. Can you describe what OpenHatch does and how our listeners can get involved?
Sure. So OpenHatch is a nonprofit and a website dedicated to lowering the barriers to entry for open source contribution. And they do this in a couple of ways. One is through running hands-on workshops, frequently on college campuses or in various underserved communities. So giving folks the opportunity to learn and then practice the tools of open source development through contributing to real projects. They also have, so there's a website that has a bunch of sort of training missions for learning the tools of open source development. And there are some other aspects to this as well, like a project Rolodex that helps you find open source projects that match your interests and skills. So, this is near and dear to my heart, as you might guess, because it's all about sort of empowering a diverse set of people to harness the power of open source software and contribute back to these communities.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's great to see organizations like that springing up from the Python community, because that, in addition to being a phenomenal language, the community is really one of the biggest strengths of Python. And it's something that I've had people from other language communities as well mention how well Python has sort of fostered that. And I think that having the PSF there to help steward the community along, I think, is a huge part of what gives Python its particular strength, whereas some other language communities are a lot more ad hoc, so they're not as able to organize around particular issues in the community as cohesively as Python can.
Yeah.
So before we move to the picks, are there any questions that we didn't ask you that you think we should have, or anything that you want to bring up to talk about?
Oh, dang. Not really. I'll see you all at PyCon, hopefully, as usual.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess then with that, we'll move to the picks, and I'll go ahead and go first. So for my first pick, I'm going to choose an application that was originally written for Mac OS X and has also been ported to Linux. I don't know if it runs on Windows or not. It's called f.lux. You might also pronounce it Flux, and it is an application that just runs in the background. You give it your zip code so that it can know where you are longitudinally, and then it will determine, based on when the sunset is for your particular location, it will then change the color tone of your computer screen so that you don't have the really harsh blue light shining on you once it starts to get dark, so that it reduces eye strain, and it also reduces some of the issues that people experience in terms of not being able to sleep after using a computer screen, which a lot of that has to do with that particular blue light spectrum that comes from electronics. So definitely worth taking a look at if you happen to be somebody who uses their computer late at night frequently. My next pick is a really interesting website and project that I came across recently called Lightyear.fm. And what it does is when you load the site, it will start off with a picture of the Earth, and then it will slowly accelerate away from the Earth. And at each sort of interval of distance, it will say, for instance, 2015, this is the song that you would be picking up in space if you were receiving our radio signals. And then it goes back all the way to about 120 years ago, to when we first started broadcasting radio signals, just so you can see at which distances you start to hear the various different things that are permeating out into space. So just really interesting way to explore that kind of subject. And for my last pick, I'm going to choose PEP 401, which introduced the From Future Import Various Fluffle. So for anybody who has not come across this PEP, I definitely highly recommend that you go and read it. I won't spoil the fun, but I will say that it was originally introduced as an April Fool's joke by Barry Warsaw, and it is well worth the read. So, Chris, what do you have?
So my first pick is a series of books, of which the most recent came out, and I'm really excited because I like this series an awful lot. It's in the category of books that's just entertaining and fun, and I plow through it like, like popcorn. It's the Alex Verus series by Benedict Jaka, and it's kind of unique. It's urban fantasy, which is one of my favorite genres, and the main character, Alex Verus, is a probability mage, which is kind of interesting. So he doesn't have any flashy powers. He can't fling fireballs around or do any cool things like that. But what he can do, which is awfully neat, is if he's going into a situation he can see all the potential futures that might come out of the situation and, react accordingly, which makes for some awfully interesting plot lines. It's a great story. I should say they're great stories. My second pick is Rick Dillon's Org Mode Structure Manipulation tutorial, which I know is a mouthful, but in the past few months I have been converted to be one of the Emacs faithful. And one of the things that I had been hearing for years from Emacs folks is Org Mode is amazing, you have to see, it's great. Avdi Grimm wrote a great piece on it. And I had played with it, but I had never really sort of actually kind of internalized what makes it so amazing or how I could actually leverage it. Now, I'm an Outliner fan from way, way back, so I knew that there was some good stuff there, but this is the first time. It's just a short YouTube screencast that will really quickly introduce you to sort of what I see as some of the really crucial nuts and bolts nitty-gritty of what Org Mode is and why you should care. It's really great stuff, and I love the rest of his series. It's called Hacking Emacs or Hack Emacs, excuse me, and it's great stuff. I recommend the whole series, really. And my last pick is going to be a card game called Dominion, and this has been around for quite a few years at this point. It's one of those games that it's not super quick to set up or anything. It takes a little bit of effort to get going. But when I was introduced to it, I was blown away by it, and every one of my friends that I've introduced to it loves it now as well. There's a tremendous amount of depth to it. It is a deck building game, but unlike sort of, a lot of the card games that you might play, your deck is this constantly growing thing throughout the game. You're just adding cards to it and adding cards, and each turn you sort of dole out a bunch from your stash. And there's a tremendous amount of depth. It's really great. I won't bother belaboring it any further. I will just say that if you like to play games, then you should check it out. That's it for me. Jessica, what kind of picks do you have for us?
Sure. So my first pick is I have perhaps the blessing and the curse that I can't listen to music or anything while I'm writing code or while I'm processing email at work. So I have to make time for that outside of work. And as a consequence, I spend a lot of time walking around the city while listening to music and listening to podcasts. And a podcast that I was sort of late to the game on, given how obviously it ties into my interests, is a podcast called Reply All, which is a podcast about the internet. And so they have episodes on everything from internet lore from the early days to did Errol Morris's brother invent email, to just a bunch of other really sort of fun anecdotes about the internet and what the internet enables that I find quite entertaining and are a wonderful way to spend my time walking around the city. So Reply All is a podcast that I very much enjoy and would recommend.
That sounds great.
My second pick is RFC 959, or perhaps insert instead your favorite or least favorite RFC. RFC 959 is the original FTP RFC. I know more about it than I would care to due to some work that I've contributed to Twisted, which is an asynchronous networking framework written in Python. And it has the distinction of being the only RFC that I've included in an email to a candidate that I was trying to sell at Dropbox. And we sort of bonded over the woes of attempting to implement this RFC. So that was a good time. And if you don't have an RFC that you love to hate, then you haven't read enough of them. And my pick is to go read a couple. And then my final pick is a book by Alan Downey. Alan is a wonderful, wonderful contributor to the Python community. And he's a professor who has published a bunch of incredibly popular books, including Think Python, which is actually Think Python is the book that I recommend to new programmers if they want to learn Python through a book. But my pick here is he's written a book called Think Stats, which is sort of an introduction to statistics using Python. I haven't taken a statistics class since I was in high school. I remember absolutely zero of it. And I'm looking forward to starting to work through this book this month to pick back up some of that material.
Yeah, we actually had Alan on the show a few weeks ago to talk about some of his work in teaching Python and also his work on the books that he's written. So it's always interesting seeing how our various episodes tie together. But yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to reading that book as well, because I too have been working on brushing up my statistics knowledge. And so far I've been trying to go through the Udacity course, but I think that reading Think Stats might actually be a little bit more effective. So thank you for reminding me of that.
Cool.
All right. So we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come on the show and talk to us. For anybody who wants to follow you or get in touch with you to talk about what we discussed here or some of the other work that you've done, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Sure. So I'm super easy to get in touch with. So if you just Google for Jess Tess, JESSTESS, I own that everywhere. You can find my email address. Definitely feel free to shoot me an email, hit me up on Twitter, all of that. Incidentally, Tess is my middle name. It's not a made-up name. So I'm Jessica Tess. I have a rhyming set of names.
Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you very much. And we really appreciate you coming on the show. And I'm sure our listeners greatly appreciate it as well. So
cool. Thank you for having me.